Okay, so a couple of us were talking over lunch about the importance of food and feasting together as Christians as part of a genuine Christian fellowship. So it was really good that we could actually do that in the context of food. And so it was good to look around and see everybody, in various types of conversations. And so I hope that all of that was as feeding to your soul as the food was to your belly. So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn back to the question that we'd been looking at last night in regards to the natural law, and go into the ancient church. But I'm not going to say too much about that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce one of the members of our steering committee, Samantha Cohoe. He's a good friend of mine. I figured who better than to introduce Caleb Coho than his own wife. And so, Samantha, would you come up and say something very amusing?
So I plan to be very professional and not amusing in introducing Caleb. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caleb Coho, who received his bachelor's from Thomas Aquinas College, a great book school in California, in liberal arts in 2006. And then he went to Princeton, where he studied in the interdepartmental program for classical philosophy, received his PhD from there in 2012. He is currently the associate professor of philosophy at Metropolitan State University of Denver, where he started teaching in 2011. And he is the author of very numerous, highly prestigiously published articles on ancient philosophy, particularly Aristotle, medieval philosophy, especially Thomas Aquinas, and the philosophy of religion. And he also has a very interesting paper on self-preservation and suicide, Stoic views of natural law and Augustine's response, which he will be sharing with us now.
Where is he born?
He's from Canada.
Okay, so there's a handout going around. So I'm going to begin my consideration of natural law with the Stoics. Why start there? Well, the Stoics have a strong case for being considered the originators of natural law. And it's also worth noting their direct interactions between Stoics and Christians even within the New Testament. So in Acts 17, Paul engages with the Stoics while in Athens. And in his famous speech on the Areopagus, he quotes from the Phenomena of the philosopher-poet Aratus, a student of Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. So this is text 1 on your handout. Paul quotes the last line, "We are indeed his offspring." The Stoics also developed their conception of natural law in a pre-Christian context, giving us some idea of the promises and perils of natural law outside Christianity. So I'm going to present their views, look at how Augustine responds to them to see what he adopts, what he rejects, and how Augustine engages with them. So what are the Stoics' views? Well, they form their views on ethics based on their overall views on reality. The Stoics identify God or Zeus with logos, eternal reason. So you use all these terms equivalently. And this logos structures all matter in the cosmos. On their view, Zeus is always at work shaping everything that happens in the world. Zeus, or reason, operates through pneuma, spirit or breath. On the Stoic view, pneuma is the active causal principle in the universe. It orders and is present in every body in the cosmos, interpenetrating all matter and holding things together and guiding them. It's like the Force. Or rather, the Force is like it, Lucas had to steal it from somewhere. And pneuma is also what directs living things. But human beings are a special case for the Stoics. We're distinguished from animals and plants because our pneuma is a rational commanding power, what the Stoics call the hegemonikon. And it decides what we should do in a self-aware and calculating manner. we control ourselves because for the Stoics we have a power of choice. We're rational beings that can assent or fail to assent to the impressions we receive from our senses about what's good and bad, what we should pursue or avoid. And whether we're good or evil depends on our choices and judgments, as Epictetus claims in text 3 on your handout. The essence of good is a sort of will, and the essence of evil is a sort of will. Prohyresis is the word he's using there, and I could talk more about that. And externals are the means by which our will finds its particular good and evil. Correct judgments about externals make our will good, as perverse or distorted ones make it bad. So for the Stoics, our ability as rational beings to consciously bring ourselves in line with the divine plan and see ourselves as part of the whole universe distinguishes us from non-rational animals. And we see this notion of participating in reason as at the core of law and following nature in Cicero's famous Stoic influenced definition of law. Text 2, taken from the De Legibus. Law is the highest reason implanted in nature, which commands what ought to be done and forbids the opposite. So for the Stoics, our reason can match universal reason, the reason that Zeus or God has, and assent to the plan of the divine Logos. And that's really our goal. As Epictetus puts it in text 4 on your handout, God has introduced humans into the world as spectators of himself and of his works, and not only as spectators, but also interpreters of them. For this reason, it's shameful that humans should begin and end where the lower animals do. They ought rather to begin there, but to end where nature itself has fixed our end. But it has fixed our end in contemplation, understanding, and a way of life in harmony with nature. So what do they think life in harmony with nature looks like? As that quote suggests, the Stoics think we need to start by reflecting. Okay. Now I'll preserve tranquility, in the Stoic. So the Stoics think living things possess various hormi, natural impulses towards things that tend to be appropriate, such as the delicious food and drink we just had. And they take one particular thing, oikeiosis, self-preservation or accommodation are two ways to translate this, and we'll be thinking more about it. They take oikeiosis to be the primary impulse, prote horme, implanted in all living things. So Diogenes Laertius in text 5 reports, the Stoics say that an animal has self-preservation as the object of its primary impulse, since nature from the beginning appropriates it to itself. The first thing appropriate to every animal, Chrysippus says, he's one of perhaps the greatest Stoic and third in line in the Stoic school after Zeno. Chrysippus says, nature appropriates its own constitution and the awareness of this to the animal. For nature was not likely either to alienate the animal from itself or to make it and then neither alienate it nor appropriate it. So it remains to say that in constituting the animal, nature appropriated it to itself. This is why the animal rejects what is harmful and accepts what is appropriate. So what do the Stoics mean here? Well, their idea is that the actions animals take from the cradle onwards are ones that preserve themselves. They pursue what's appropriate to their nature. The squirrel's very good at finding things that squirrels can eat, and naturally avoids predators and any danger that would harm it. And the Stoics also use this idea of oikeiosis to serve as the grounds for the actions of parents to protect their children, and in general for the cooperative and social actions that various living beings, especially humans, undertake. There's this question in trying to interpret the Stoics of how these different aspects of oikeiosis fit together. Is there one impulse that's really operative in all these cases, or are there different versions of oikeiosis? And it's hard to tell, partly because our access to Stoic texts is quite limited. but I'm just going to briefly lay out two leading interpretations. So on one, oikiosis as it operates in rational human beings who are wise is quite different from the kind of oikiosis you find in a squirrel. These interpreters think that as rationality develops, what we as humans take to be akin to us or a suitable object of concern, oikeon, changes. And for the wise person, it's ultimately the thing they're trying to preserve will be the order and rationality of the whole cosmos. Not just myself, but the rational order of the whole. So on your handout, I call this the rational order interpretation. The wise person's primary impulse is not directed towards self-preservation, but to promoting the rational ordering of the whole cosmos. As Gisela Stryker puts it, self-preservation is replaced as a primary goal by the desire for order and harmony. So that's one view of what oikeiosis looks like in rational human beings who are living according to the natural law. Then there's an alternative interpretation that Jacob Klein offers. He thinks that what oikeiosis really involves is an impulse towards preserving one's constitution, and in particular to preserving the hegemonikon, or ruling principle. So text 7 on your handout, Klein says, oikeiosis should be identified with an impulse to preserve the animal's leading faculty, or hegemonikon, in a condition of conformity to nature. And so this will often manifest itself in actions that promote the animal's biological preservation, but it includes all activities undertaken to support and conserve the animal's functions. So the constitution preservation interpretation, as I have it on your handout, says that oikeiosis is operative and successful as long as the animal is acting to best preserve its constitution, even if circumstances make it difficult or impossible to do so with complete success. And then the Stoics can then use this idea of preserving what we are to support the importance of virtue. The idea is, for the Stoics, is that virtue is what allows humans to sustain our constitution as rational beings, preserving the functioning of our reasoning principle, of our ruling principle, which is reason and virtue. So the squirrel is trying to preserve itself as a squirrel, but we're trying to preserve ourselves as rational, virtuous beings. So really, self-preservation and pursuing virtue turn out to be one and the same. So we've got these two views, and I wanted to lay them out there because I then now want to apply them to the case of the question of when we should or should not preserve our biological life. Because here the Stoics famously defend the moral appropriateness and indeed necessity of ending one's life under certain circumstances. So text 8 on your handout, we see Seneca's emphasis on preserving my mind over my body. So this has come from Seneca's letters. He says, if the body is useless for its duties, why wouldn't it be appropriate to escort the failing mind out the door? And perhaps it's to be done a little before it needs to be, to avoid the situation where you're unable to do it when it needs to be done. And since there's a greater danger in living badly than there is in dying swiftly, he's a fool who doesn't buy out the risk of a great misfortune by paying a small price in time. Few make it to their deaths intact if old age is greatly prolonged. Many have a passive life, lying there unable to make use of themselves. In the end, there is no crueler loss in life than the loss of the right to end it. So here we have the founders of natural law and advocates of self-preservation. They didn't even make it to figuring out how to rightly worship God. We're having trouble just on the self-preservation bit. But why? Well, first, no, Seneca's language about having the right to end one's life, autonomy. First of all, they're picking up on themes that are very prominent in contemporary discussions of euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I think when we get to the Stoics' views of the self and these interpretations of oikeiosis I've just offered, we see why they think suicide is the right thing to do in some cases. Because what I'm preserving for Seneca is my constitution or my mind. I'm preserving what I need to hold on to is the rule of reason and the mind over body. And so I should choose to give up my life sooner rather than risk having my mind and controlling part be damaged or impaired. So my life ends, but it ends with reason still in control and taking that last action instead of taking that risk that my biological life will go on, but my reason will no longer be ruling as effectively. And I think this fits with both those interpretations I've laid out. So on the rational order view, if I find out the cosmos would be better served by my death or the death of family members and loved ones, don't worry, I don't think this, then oikeiosis would dictate and ending those lives for the sake of the rational order of the whole. And even on the Constitution preservation interpretation, what you're preserving is the Constitution, the right relation between the ruling reason and the body that is ruled. So I'm supposed to be willing to risk leaving early and missing out on some life in order to keep my hegemonicon ruling till the end. As Seneca puts it in text 9, if old age starts to weaken my intelligence, to dislodge its parts, if what it leaves me is not a life, but just being alive, then I shall jump clear of a decayed and collapsing building. And this goes into the Stoic view that our biological lives and those of our family and friends are in the realm of what they call preferred indifference. So these are things that should generally be preferred over their opposites. So I generally prefer life over death, health over sickness, wealth over poverty. But I'm not supposed to, for the Stoics, value these things in themselves. I should be willing to give up life, health, or wealth if that's what the universe and reason decree. So my will for them can only be conditional. And for the Stoics, the goodness of my will is judged on whether it conforms to reason or not whether it succeeds in getting or hanging on to these things. You can go back to text 3 on that. And if my opinion that it's good for my life to go on does not match reason's judgment, I should change my opinion and change my will. So as Cicero presents the Stoic position, text 10 from De Finibus, it is the appropriate action to live when most of what one has is in accordance with nature. When the opposite is the case, or is envisaged to be so, then the appropriate action is to depart from life. This shows that it's sometimes the appropriate action for the wise person to depart from life, though happy, and the fool to remain in it, though miserable. Often the appropriate action for a wise person will be to depart from life when utterly happy, if this can be done in a timely way. So even if I'm living a virtuous and wise life, willing to continue it can be wrong and foolish if it goes against the indications I'm getting from nature and the universe. Wisdom herself can tell the wise person to end things. And if I don't end my life, I would cease to be happy and wise because I'm not following reason. So life in harmony with nature for the Stoics ends up realizing our very limited place in the universe. We have a temporary place that requires promoting what's beneficial to the whole and listening to reason when our time is up. So that's the Stoic view. Now, how does Augustine respond? Well, Augustine thinks the Stoics get a number of things right. They recognize divine reason as the standard to which we should look in determining what's good. That's how Augustine thinks of the eternal law. And they value virtue and immaterial goods over external goods, such as wealth and status. And Augustine also agrees that self-preservation is a crucial part of the natural order God has created. So in his expositions on the Psalms, text 12 on your handout, Augustine maintains that there's a principle of unity, termed spirit or soul, present in all living things, urging them to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain and the preservation of their own soundness. Sorry. In fact, Sarah Byers, contemporary Augustine scholar, goes so far as to claim, text 10, that Augustine knew and was influenced by the Stoics' account of the primary impulse towards self-preservation. And we hear echoes of this when Augustine speaks of the voluntas humana, an innate drive to preserve one's own life by which man naturally wills to live. But of course, Augustine rejects suicide, parting ways with the Stoics on what self-preservation involves. So I think Byers is putting things too strongly. Augustine's account of the human will to live is a transformation of the Stoic idea, not just an echo. But Augustine's view of the basis of our will to live is fundamentally different. But where does he part ways with the Stoics? Where does he think they go wrong? For Augustine, it's because the Stoics have misunderstood the will to live. Their understanding of human nature and the will is off. Well, this is partly because of defects in their theology. Augustine also thinks that philosophical reflection shows us that we will and should will to preserve our own lives, our very being, not just a temporary, not just our temporary place or the rational order we are part of. And I think he thinks this is evident to reason. The Stoics actually have to work pretty hard to convince themselves of the case for suicide. So they're denying what's clear based on their desire to control happiness on their own. So I think on Augustine's view, we have this voluntas for happiness, but it's not a natural or biological impulse. It's a distinctive kind of impulse to the good, shared by all spiritual and rational beings, and implanted in our hearts by God to lead us to him. Our will to live comes from our love of being and goodness, not just from our attachment to a positively functioning biological constitution. And this impulse to live, to being, for Augustine is unconditional and should never be abandoned based on circumstances. So we see this in his third book of Free Choice of the Will, text 13 on your handout. He says, if you will to escape from unhappiness, love within yourself this, that you will to be. For if you will more and more to be, you will approach him who is in the highest degree, and give thanks that you are now. For even though you're inferior to those who are happy, you're superior to things that do not have even the will to be happy. All things that are deserve praise simply in virtue of the fact that they are. For they are good simply in virtue of the fact that they are. The more you love being, the more you will desire eternal life. And so the more you will long to be refashioned so that your affections are no longer temporal, branded upon you by the love of temporal things, that before they exist are nothing. So here Augustine makes it clear that our will to live is unconditional, and unlike Stoic oikeiosis, is directed towards being, not specifically to order or reason. My voluntas humana always loves my being, and from that love can ascend to loving being and goodness itself, God. And Augustine thinks this voluntas could not, as such, impel me to end my life. The Stoics have just misunderstood what our impulse for self-preservation is. Indeed, in the same passage, Augustine insists that even if you're unhappy and do not will to be unhappy, you would rather be and be unhappy than not be at all. Contrary to Seneca and the Stoics, Augustine insists that being is itself valuable, so valuable that it makes an unhappy life better than no life at all. And so the Stoic account of oikeiosis misunderstands the metaphysical significance of this desire for self-preservation. In fact, Augustine claims, text 14 on your handout, your will to be is like a first step. If you go on from there to set your sight more and more on being, you will rise to that which is in the highest degree. Thus, my will to live should not be restrained. It's not a danger. Instead, it's the pathway to despising distracting temporal goods and clinging to God, essay itself. This is quite different, both from the Stoics' articulated views of oikeiosis and from their views on biological life as an external good that we need to be willing to give up. Augustine then goes on to argue that we cannot and should not will not to be. Willing not to be could never be what you should do, because, text 15, what you ought to will must be better, but that which is not able to be better. And the idea here is our will is always directed towards being, and so it can never be right that we should will non-being, since non-being is nothing, and nothing can't be better than there's no something that nothing can be better than, because it's nothing. A note here, the reliance on the convertibility of being and goodness. And so when Augustine then goes on to discuss suicide, he insists even in those who take their lives, text 16, the will's desire for death is not a desire for non-being, but a desire for peace. So those desiring this are gripped by a misleading feeling that peace, which is better than the restlessness they are experiencing, will be the result of their actions. So they're not really choosing nothing over something. They're choosing something that seems to be and be good. So Augustine thinks the wrongness of suicide is available to human reason. In fact, the best philosophers, the Platonists, recognize that our will loves being and goodness. So, as I've already mentioned, a lot of the arguments I've just gone over rely on the convertibility of being and goodness, this characteristic Platonic idea. And in his On the Trinity, we see Augustine giving a definition of love that echoes Plato. So text 17 from book 9, he asks, what is it to love something, except to will it to be available for you in order to enjoy it? And I think Augustine's phrasing here makes the Platonic background of his views apparent. In the Symposium, Diotima tells Socrates that love is wanting to possess the good for oneself forever. Text 18. And here, Augustine's insistence that one wills the good sibi esse, to be for oneself, really closely mirrors Diotima's language in Greek of wanting the good auto enai, again, to be for oneself. And the Platonic tradition also recognizes the need for securely possessing the good and having it as one's own good to achieve happiness. So in the Symposium itself, this claim about love leads directly to the claim that immortality is required for the lover to get what he wants and be happy. Text 19. A lover must desire immortality along with the good if what we agreed earlier was right, that love wants to possess the good for oneself forever. It follows that love must desire immortality. So only living forever could allow one to have the kind of union with the good that would make one happy. Augustine thinks the Platonists recognize this truth through their reason. The problem with the Stoics is not their reliance on reason or their attempts to formulate what natural law requires. It really does require self-preservation for Augustine. Instead, the problem is the Stoics pervert reason and natural law in an attempt to be self-sufficient and achieve happiness on their own. Augustine sees them as deploying a coping strategy. Since we know we're unhappy when our desires are unsatisfied, we're tempted, due to our thoroughly warped nature, as he describes it in Book 13 of De Trinitate, to wrongly will the things that we can get and avoid willing things that we can't. And this is precisely what proud philosophers attempt to do. Unable to secure an everlasting and good life on their own, they pretend that things such as autonomy and rational order are enough for happiness, and that one can be supremely happy even when ending one's life. So as Augustine critiques them in Book 13 of On the Trinity, text 20, the philosophers have all constructed their own happy lives as each has thought best, as though they could manage by their own virtue what they could not manage in their common condition of mortal men, namely to live as they would. So for Augustine, when I'm enduring something I would not intrinsically will, I'm not happy because I'm not living as I will. Even if I do manage to exercise virtues of courage and patience, these are virtues, Augustine says, that war against vices and prepare me for happiness, but don't constitute happiness. He also talks about this in Book 19 of the City of God. In the end of the text 20 passage, Augustine develops his attack by pointing to the case of courage, where the virtuous person is resolute under trying circumstances. He asks, how then can the brave person be said to live as he would like? Because he's willingly brave and bearing unflinchingly what he would rather had not been inflicted on him? But the reason he wills what he can do is that he cannot do what he wills. That's the sum total, whether it makes you laugh or cry, of the happiness of proud mortals who boast that they live as they will because they bear patiently with what they do not will to happen to them. Augustine insists that the Stoic strategy of patient endurance, willing resignation, and going along with what reason seems to them to reveal is a failure. The Stoics claim that our internal choices make us happy or wretched, and whether our willing issues in successful external action is irrelevant. Seneca wants to say, as long as he's in control, as long as he's choosing how to respond to his life circumstances, he can be happy and virtuous. Because we can always affirm what the universe prescribes, whether it's an indifferent we would prefer or not, we can always do what we will and be happy. And this is why the Stoics think we are free and our happiness and goodness are up to us. But Augustine, by contrast, insists that our natural reason can recognize our vulnerability and our need for a transcendent good. So while keeping the Stoic insistence on the value of a good will, he maintains that our wills can only be satisfied through our continued being, through willing to live, and ultimately through our union in love with being itself, with God, the supreme good. Thank you.
Okay. So I've got the mic, and you got the question.
Just a curiosity, really not a big question. So the Stoics taught that animals have a natural impulse towards self-preservation, which makes sense because animal suicide is very rare. I mean, it does happen, but it's very rare.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, did Augustine believe the same thing? Because you were talking earlier about how this is available to human reason. Do animals just have that even though they don't have human reason?
Yeah, so that's text 12. Augustine is speaking about all living things and saying all living things have some kind of spirit or soul, and one of the first things that does is preserve their own soundness. But in the case of plants and animals, they just have this instinct or impulse to act in ways that will be appropriate and preserve themselves. But they can't reflect on or reject. They might, if things get messed up, they can do things that will kill themselves, but not qua sua. They don't think, oh, life is hard, I need to end it. Whereas that is available to humans precisely because we have reason, and that can mess us up because we can start thinking, oh, maybe I would have peace and I'd get away from my desires and failures if I did this, whereas that's not available to
Well, you do have very rare cases of, like, Flipper the dolphin committed suicide, or a dog, his owner dies and he gets so sad he commits suicide. But that would be very rare cases of they're obviously not rationally thinking about it. They're, like you said, it's just something got really messed up and they just stop eating or jump in the water.
It might have affected their desires such that they no longer something about their loss of joy or these positive emotions then lead to them not eating or whatever.
A sort of more broader kind of background practical question. So, for those who are more just kind of newly initiated to the questions of natural law, and you're reading the literature, and you'll have somebody say, "Oh, Seneca says this," and whomever. How do we? And I'm asking this actually for myself. We appropriate them, so thinking these things. Like I'm looking at this, hearing what you're saying, reading these quotes, and Augustine seems like not even like a supplement, to them, but to perfecting of them is probably too hard of a word, but we're going through that. And I'm like, oh man. And then you read him and you're like, yes. And it feels, you sort of feel good about yourself in a way. But obviously I don't want to make it seem like, oh, the Stoics are giving us, kicking off this sort of thinking, and we can get past them. So how can we actually rightly use them, with all of the necessary caveats?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that I think Augustine does take over something of this method, that we can look at how other living creatures really do act in ways that preserve their natures. And the Stoics are getting a lot. It's not like they're going around telling people to kill themselves all the time. So they do actually advocate self-preservation. Most of the time, it's more that this idea of valuing rational order instead of just valuing being and continued existence is what misleads them in these cases. But they are partly why I wanted to bring in Plato, is that it's not just that you need to be a Christian to see this. It's that if you saw a tighter connection between being and goodness, you'd get a better perspective on self-preservation. But some of the core ideas, so I quoted that Cicero's definition of law, text 2, because I think Augustine does really take that over, and his idea of the eternal law and reason, which is the standard for everyone, that there is this highest reason, and it's really reflected in creation. But with the fall and our inability to be happy, we're tempted to distort it in various ways. And I think it's important in Augustine's analysis of the Stoics, it's not so much that they make this intellectual blunder, it's that they're really committed to achieving happiness for themselves, and so that then warps how they view something like self-preservation.
So is it sort of like, especially in relation to Augustine, his right ordering of loves in a way? They've got the right idea, and yet it's terminating at the wrong place. So for them, self-preservation is good, but whether it's the rational, Augustine's is, the love should terminate on some of these, the more ultimate, like to be.
Yeah, but it's interesting. I guess what I find really interesting about that quote, text 13, is that often this is thought of as like the lowest level thing, as Brad was talking about last night, more nature than law. You just sort of, most of us would like to continue existing and do the things necessary. But Augustine thinks even in this most basic impulse, there's something transcendent implanted in that. So just from my will to continue to existing, when I reflect on that and think what I'm wanting, that I'm wanting being for myself and continued being, but my being, I'm not in control of, living forever. Just thinking about self-preservation is already directing me up towards being itself. So I think that's one thing I really like in Augustine, the idea that sort of the whole natural law and all these parts of our natural impulses have this transcendent dimension that's always pushing us back towards our Creator.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have just a question. Speaking of number 13, I guess I'll just read the quote and ask my question. So, the more you love being, the more you will desire eternal life. And so the more you will long to be refashioned so that your affections are no longer temporal, branded upon you by the love of temporal things that before they exist are nothing. That to me seems to be contradictory. And I guess I'm trying to figure out if I'm thinking about that quote in the right way. There seems to be this delicate balance of going from loving being to hating being in order to be set on this trajectory of immortality or eternity. Is that what he's getting at?
Yeah, so let me say how I'm reading that, and then you can see if that helps. So I think Augustine's thought is I love my own being and want it to continue, but I'm might be tempted by temporal things to think that really, if I publish a few more articles, give a few more talks, and people like it, then that will really preserve my being and give me the kind of life I want to have. But his idea is, when I actually think about whether fame or publishing or being liked on social media is going to help me in my goals, all these temporal things don't. They don't last. They're not useful. So even if I'm only concerned about self-preservation, I need to start looking to something that's more lasting to preserve my own being. And so I'll get away from these temporal things that are subject to change and destruction and start looking for something lasting that I can connect up to. And that's where God's going to come in. Does that?
Okay, so it seems like the hinge point for this argument for Augustine is that being is convertible with goodness, being is better than non-being, whatever kind of being it is. But if you're a Stoic and you're looking at the good of the whole order, you could conclude that removing yourself from that order, it doesn't actually affect the amount of like overall non-being or something like that, right? So then that wouldn't necessarily argue against the morality of doing that. Like you could still say, I'm looking at the good of the whole. So reason tells me the whole will be better off if I remove myself from it. And there's also just sort of a plausibility to the idea that it's better to die than to live shamefully, right? Like Cato kills himself and you're kind of like, that was a good call, you know? Like,
Yeah, Dante was impressed.
So I guess how would you and Augustine respond to that?
Yeah. So we'll work together. So yeah, let me first say, yeah, I think the Stoics just reject the convertibility of being and goodness. So in that sense, I haven't really given an argument that from the Stoics' own position they should accept what Augustine's saying. Now, but what I think the key move is, and where they're really disagreeing, is that they both think we should value goodness, but for the Stoics, precisely because I'm vulnerable, it can't be my own goodness that I'm ultimately valuing. It has to be this rational order that I participate in. And I think Augustine thinks, and I'm with him here, that psychologically that's, I really care about the good for myself. I'll be honest with you, and for you too. But I'm very connected to you, so it's easier. And that's why I think it's really significant in both Augustine's definition of love and then that passage from the Symposium that I was quoting, that you have the for oneself in there. Because once you love once you love being and good, but you love your being and your good, then I'm looking for a way that I can really promote being and goodness while still getting to keep and continue my being and goodness. And you just can't get that on the Stoic picture, except insofar as you think we can sort of if my reason is the same as the divine reason, so that it goes on in a way I go on too. But I think that's not really the personal-erotic desire for being and goodness that Augustine is picking up on in Plato, and that I want to be happy. I'm with him there. I don't know how you feel, but I know how you feel. I don't know about everyone else.
Actually, it's kind of great because I was thinking of that something along those lines and wondering if the convertibility of goodness and being was the only factor in their diverging views on whether or not self-preservation, or what implications you draw from your notion of self-preservation. Could another factor be maybe, do they have some kind of canonical hierarchy of the good that would play a role in the implications they draw about self-preservation, under what conditions you should kill yourself or not?
Yeah, well, so there, I think two things. One is you're looking to the rational order, not just to being. And the other thing is what I mentioned, this idea that my biological life is itself an external good, in the way that I think my body is an external good. I'm not fully in control of either of them, and so I can't be attached to them. What I really need to focus on is the choices I make using my reason, because those on the Stoic view I am fully in control of. So it's coming both from desiring to preserve rational order, but also from this idea that my relationship to my life, like my relationship to my body for the Stoics, is somewhat external, precisely because I'm lacking in full control of those things, and they can be taken away from me.
So a couple questions. One, hopefully fairly straightforward. The other, weird and complex, potentially. So the first straightforward one. So am I correct that the Stoics didn't really have a belief in a personal afterlife?
Yeah. So most Stoics did not. So, but they famously think that my happiness can be complete in a moment. So as soon as I attain virtue, I've sort of lived the happy life just in fully getting reason, and that's sort of good enough. My reason is the same as the divine reason. They also have some doubts about whether anyone's actually been in this state. But if you were, you'd only need to be there for an instant for your whole life to count as happy, even if you don't continue. The one complication is that Chrysippus says something that seems to indicate the souls of the virtuous may be able to persist, because they're the Stoic understanding of the soul is pneuma. It is this interpenetrated with matter, and virtue is sort of like how good your pneuma is at controlling matter. The virtuous might be so good that even when their bodies are destroyed, their rough and controlling pneuma like lasts in the universe for some period, at least until the great conflagration, which we could get into.
Okay.
So
actually, I mean, my
sorry,
first question,
that was more complicated.
Yeah, no, my first question even
but
has two
mostly
stages,
no,
so-
maybe Chrysippus.
Well, I mean, the reason it's interesting because it almost seems like if you had a doctrine of the afterlife, then it'd be easier to make the argument for suicide. And so, and from Augustine's perspective, if he doesn't think that you go into non-being when you commit suicide, you do actually continue in being.
Right.
So I don't quite understand how his argument has so much traction if he's saying, I mean, unless he wants to say, well, but your being in a body is a fuller, higher form of being than a bodiless being, which would certainly be a more Aristotelian tack. But Augustine, as Platonist, I don't quite see the strength in saying you should love being, and therefore you need to make sure you continue in your bodily being.
So I could still love being, but yeah, maybe I don't love being embodied so much anymore, and so I want to leave that behind. Is that the
Yes. Why is that not a plausible tack for a Platonist to say?
Yeah. Well, and this is something that is explored. Partly, I think that so Socrates appeals in the Phaedo to this idea that, we've been stationed here, we shouldn't leave before our time is up. But then the Stoics can sort of reinterpret that and say, look, you're getting signals. You find out you have dementia or something. Now's a good time to go. And I think I'm not sure early Augustine is a great answer. I think by the time you get to the City of God and on the Trinity, where Augustine is really working to have something more like an Aristotelian picture, where the body is a central part of who we are, then preserving my being can't just be preserving my soul, because that's not all I am, and that's not all I will be in the complete state. So I think that's his answer. But to say that to the Platonist, I think he might really need to say that the Platonists are wrong in fully identifying ourselves with the souls. He also has issues with the Platonists because he says they seem to think disembodied existence is better, but they also have this theory of cycles. So I'm never really going to be happy. I'll be off on my own as a soul without a body for a little while, but then I have to come back. And so that's Porphyry's picture, and that's really no good. So he has some ways of engaging them, but he would have to go in a different direction than with the Stoics.
All right, since that was all my first question, I'll give my second make my second question simpler than it was otherwise going to be, and you can punt it if you want. But just to say, it seems like in the current environment, we have this weird situation where on the one hand, you have the big push for euthanasia and assisted suicide, and we want to make something like this Augustinian argument for the goodness of continuing and being. And yet, we at the same time have the other extreme, which is people who are trying to prolong their lives by whatever means possible. And we seem to have this unhealthy obsession with using advanced medicine to keep ourselves alive longer than it seems like we're supposed to be. It seems like it's our time, and we use language. It was, it was her time to go or whatever, and that was. So how do you? Are there resources in Augustine's account for pushing back against that? I mean, because it on its own, as you've articulated Augustine's account, it would seem to lead to, well, yeah, I mean, to keep yourself alive as long as you possibly can, and there's not some point at which life is not worth living anymore. But.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not going to be that life isn't worth living, but I think they're a key Augustinian idea that I'm working on another paper on. It's just that our current condition isn't even for Christians one that counts as truly happy, because of the limitations of our bodies, the way they decay, the way our hopes, our temporal hopes can be frustrated, the way things can happen to our family and friends. So Augustine wants to say, prolonging the kind of existence we have now doesn't really help so much with happiness, because we're not really living the happy life now. It's only the hope of the resurrection, where you have spiritual union with God, but also, and this isn't so much there in the early stuff, the free choice of the will, it comes out more in the City of God. You're also going to have all these temporal goods as well in a secure way. You'll have these perfected, resurrected bodies. You'll have lasting friendships that can't be be taken away. So preserving this life, which is good insofar as it is, but isn't the happy life, instead of hoping to and looking for the everlasting life that truly is happy, is a mistake. So life is good, but the life we're living isn't the really good life, the happy life. So I think that's at least as I read him, his answer.
Since I think both Drs. Van Drunen and Littlejohn hit on this, that part of understanding what natural law is understanding the moral law of God, as revealed in Scripture. They're the same thing. The moral law of God is natural law, and it's revealed in nature. And I'm wondering, since we're talking about natural law, with Augustine in the City of God, I think maybe I'm wrong. I'm not incredibly familiar with it, but he gives an argument against suicide that it's murder. And I'm wondering, is that his primary focus, that it's murder, and because it's murder, now I'm going to explain to the Stoics in their language why it is murder? Or is the fact that it's murder just another reason among many for Augustine to not commit suicide? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think morally, I think that might be the key decisive reason. I think the perspective I was coming at it from is, what am I making a mistake about in, or where is my love going wrong there, that I'm not really understanding this love that I should have for being. So I guess I'd say there's the kind of two ways Augustine operates. One is to say that anything we love, there's really something good there and worth affirming. The problem, as Ian was mentioning earlier, is just sometimes our loves get misordered, and we love some things more than we should. But when we properly understand them, it's interesting. What might look like a base love of loving oneself and self-preservation actually can connect us up. But I think in terms of thinking morally why it's bad, yeah, Augustine would put a fair amount of weight on, you're intentionally taking a human life, one that is your own, but just as you can't take others' lives, it applies to yourself as well.
Make this the last question.
Actually, what I'm going to do, and maybe he wouldn't be willing, but I would like to maybe punt to Dr. Van Drunen on the question of prolonging life unreasonably as opposed to suicide. Would you have anything to say on that? Just rather than trying to re-articulate what I had read by you, and if not, I'm not going to try.
Are you asking about the distinction between taking one's life in the sense of suicide as opposed to doing everything possible to keep oneself alive? Yeah. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a really important moral distinction to make there, and although it can be challenging as to why exactly, what exactly is the difference between those. And I mean, I think one way to see it, I don't know if this is exactly Augustine's answer, although I think you'd agree that both what was it, Brad's question about you have this sort of strange tension, this sort of obsession of keeping yourself alive as long as possible, even if it involves all these extraordinary medical things that make your life miserable, and this right to suicide. Maybe part of what they have in common is this sense that we are masters of our own life, that we're lords of ourselves, and if I want to keep myself alive longer, even if it's going to make myself miserable and people around me miserable and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, I should be able to do that. And if I'm sick of life and I don't want to go on, I have a right to do that. And there's a the fact that we ought to recognize that we're not lords of our own life ultimately, I think critiques both of those sorts of tendencies. I mean, I think Augustine would agree with that. I don't know if he doesn't. I don't know if he put. I mean, he's not addressing our situation. They can't really conceive of the things we can do to keep ourselves alive grotesquely long. But I think it would be an Augustinian way to think of it, I think.
You're mostly quoting De Trinitate, City of God, and that, which seems to be later works of Augustine. Do you see any of his dealing with the Stoics earlier in his writing against the philosophers, things like that?
Oh yeah. So when I could quote from Free Choice of the Will, because I think that's actually where he's closest to expressing a view that is quite Stoic. It's less clear there that well, he says things there and in his On the Happy Life that might seem to suggest that human virtue on itself would be enough for happiness, and he's explicit in his retractions that he should not have said that virtue on its own isn't enough, but both because he thinks you need the fullness of human flourishing that involves the body and these other goods, and also because he thinks that makes it seem too independent from God, that you really need that connection to God. So that's something that is more Stoic in his earlier thought, but then he backs away in for both theological and anthropological reasons.
All right. Thank you very much, Caleb. Okay, so what I think we'll do is we're going to have the panel discussion, maybe take a break until 1:45. So that gives us 10 minutes. And then the way it's going to run is we'll set up some chairs here, and I'll call you back to order sort of once everything's ready to go.